Cameras flashed non-stop. Caleb gently placed his hand on Jade's back, just as they stepped into the spotlight. In an instant, his face lit up with the perfect smile, his arm creating just enough intimacy to keep the media from asking questions. But the moment the flashes stopped, that hand slipped away as if it had never been there. He adjusted his cufflinks, murmured something to his assistant, and walked off, leaving her to quietly follow behind. Jade stood in the grand hall surrounded by marble and people in perfectly tailored suits, yet she had never felt so alone. The deep blue dress the stylist sent that morning hugged her figure flawlessly, not because she chose it, but because it matched the event tone Caleb wanted her to represent. The dress, the jewelry, the hair, even the expression on her face. Every detail was calculated to make her just radiant enough, but never bright enough to outshine her husband. She was far too familiar with parties like this. The warm handshakes, the hollow compliments, the knowing nods. Caleb was a powerful tech investor in San Francisco. Just his presence made the crowd instinctively part to make way for him. And Jade, the woman who once stood on scaffolding painting murals under the summer sun, now quietly stood beside him as part of the Caleb Warren brand. Powerful, polished, and accessorized with a beautiful wife. "This is my wife, Jade," he said to some CEO whose name she couldn't remember, his tone as flat as if he were introducing a successful investment. She smiled, nodded, extended her hand for a light shake, the perfect embodiment of Mrs. Caleb. Not too dazzling to draw attention, not too distant to seem cold. It was a smile that didn't exist in her real palette of emotions, but it fit the role flawlessly. Caleb wasn't a rude man. He was always on time, always polite in his emails, always said thank you to the waiter pouring his wine. But it was that very perfection that exhausted Jade more than any harshness ever could. Because with Caleb, everything was calculated. Even their silences had structure. She had once loved his confidence. When they first met, she'd been painting a mural for a community center, and Caleb showed up with a proposal to fund a creative city campaign. He spoke smoothly, met her eyes directly, and made her believe she could be more than just a girl with a paintbrush. But as the years passed, Jade came to realize Caleb never loved her colors. He only saw them as tools to add a touch of diversity to his philanthropic portfolio. The party ended at 10. People slowly began to leave. There were still a few hugs, pats on the back, and promises of future collaborations. Caleb left first, as always. The driver was already waiting. He got into the car without looking back. Jade followed, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She wasn't expecting a compliment about how she looked, or even a simple question about whether she was tired. Inside the sleek, black SUV, the interior lights glowed softly. Caleb unlocked his phone and began scrolling through emails. Jade looked out the window. The city drifted by like a fast-forwarded film. Yellow lights, red lights, pedestrians, car horns, all sliding past without leaving a trace of feeling. She tried to remember the last time Caleb had held her hand in public. She couldn't. She wasn't even sure he ever had. Maybe when he proposed? Maybe at the board's gala? She wasn't sure anymore. Everything in her memory had turned hazy, like a painting covered in dust. Caleb spoke suddenly, eyes still fixed on his screen. "Do you have anything on your schedule tomorrow?" "Nothing important. The stylist will send a new outfit. You'll come with me to the product launch next week." "Okay," she replied flatly. No one asked if she wanted to go. She didn't object either. Everything went on exactly as it always did. The car stopped in front of the tall glass tower they called home. The door opened. The driver offered a polite goodnight, and no one answered. Jade stepped into the grand marble lobby, the security guard bowing his head as she passed. Everything was flawless, like a luxurious stage she had performed on for far too long. But deep inside, a question echoed hollowly. How long has it been since I stopped being myself? And no one, not even Caleb, seemed to notice. The next morning, when Caleb left early with his assistant, Jade remained motionless in the living room. Not because she was tired, but because she didn't want to do anything at all. Sunlight filtered through the massive penthouse windows, gliding across the cold marble floor, casting a quiet kind of beauty. She looked around. Everything was perfect by every standard. The glass coffee table, the Italian sofa, the abstract painting by a famous contemporary artist. But none of it belonged to her. Her schedule arrived by email every night from Caleb's assistant. They called it a coordinated calendar, meant to prevent any overlap with the events she was expected to attend by his side. There was never a single entry for her personal life. No one asked if she wanted to go anywhere or if she needed a day to do nothing. If she didn't reply, they simply assumed she agreed. Up on the rooftop, there was a studio. She'd once asked Caleb to let her keep that space when they moved in. He'd nodded. Of course, you need your creative space. But now the room was covered in a thin layer of dust. The easel stood alone, the paint tubes had hardened, and the unfinished sketches lay in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Jade couldn't remember the last time she painted, or when she stopped altogether. She used to dream of painting across different cities. There was a time she ran a small studio in the Mission District, a place bursting with color and street artists. She taught kids how to paint, created murals for little local shops, joined projects that brought life back to forgotten public spaces. Caleb had come by one September afternoon, standing among the kids and saying something she would never forget. "You don't have to do all this anymore. I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. You'll never have to work another hard day again." Back then, she believed that was love. Now she realized that promise was the beginning of her disappearance. Day by day, layer by layer, her colors were washed away until only a version of herself remained. One Caleb could easily manage, display, and carry around like an expensive accessory. And the worst part was, she had let it happen without ever fighting back. One afternoon, while trying to clean up a pile of old sketchbooks in her workspace, Jade accidentally opened an old photo folder on her laptop. Inside were hundreds of pictures of her past works. Walls brought back to life with color, once gray neighborhoods turned vibrant, and photos of herself, with paint-stained clothes, a bright smile, her hand raised like a kid at play. She stared at those pictures for a long time, so long she forgot what she'd been doing. The woman in those photos didn't look like her anymore, and what frightened her most was that she wasn't sure that woman still existed. The next day, instead of letting the driver take her to the spa as scheduled, she texted to cancel. Instead, she put on a coat, pulled a beanie over her hair, and walked out of the building. She told no one. She wandered through a neighborhood less than 20 minutes from downtown, filled with second-hand bookstores, small independent cafes, and a few art studios she used to know when she was still single. Jade stopped at a cafe with windows facing the street, ordered a cappuccino, sat at a small table, and opened her notebook to write the first few lines she'd written in years. Not for anyone else, just for herself. Thoughts she'd never spoken. Feelings she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. That day, she stayed at the cafe until late afternoon. No one called. No one texted to ask where she was. Not even Caleb. He probably thought she was at the spa, or at home, or maybe he just didn't think about her at all. From that day on, she started going out more. Not to escape, but to breathe. She stopped by the community library one afternoon and stumbled upon an adult sketchbook sharing event. She signed up. She took walks through the park near the pier, sitting quietly to watch children play ball. She bought a few new tubes of watercolor, not to use in her studio, but to carry in her bag. As if having them close was enough to remind her that she was still alive. Those changes happened quietly. No one in the house noticed. Caleb didn't notice. She had more dinners alone now. His schedule was always packed. He didn't ask questions when she went to bed early or disappeared for the day. To him, Jade was still the same obedient wife, polite, composed, predictable. And in that silence, Jade began to hear her own voice again, the one she'd forgotten long ago. The one that used to whisper to her, "This isn't all there is. You weren't born just to be kept polished like an object." And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to listen. Her life was changing quietly, piece by piece, but enough that Caleb eventually noticed, only because someone else pointed it out. That night, at a private networking event on a rooftop bar in Soma, between the small talk about data and venture capital, an older man clapped Caleb on the shoulder and laughed the easy laugh of an old friend. "I saw your wife at the Starbucks in Hayes Valley the other day," the man said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "She was with some guy. Don't know who he was, but they looked pretty close." Caleb looked up. For just a second, his eyes froze. Then he laughed. A smooth, cold laugh, like everything was already under control. "Probably an old friend. She knows a lot of people in the creative scene." The man raised an eyebrow, seemed about to say more, then changed the subject to rumors about a new investment fund. Caleb poured himself another drink, but this time he drank slower. That night, Jade came home later than usual. No text, no call. Just walked in around 8:30, holding her coat, her hair a little messy, cheeks flushed from the wind. Caleb looked up from his laptop when he heard the door open, but said nothing. Jade didn't explain either. She slipped off her shoes, greeted him softly, and headed straight to the dressing room. He watched her walk away, and something inside him hesitated. Not out of jealousy. Jealousy was a feeling for people still in love. What Caleb felt was something else entirely, a sharp discomfort, the kind he felt when discovering an employee had gone behind his back on a deal. It was the feeling of losing control. At dinner, she mentioned a few small things, a new book at a local bookstore, a little girl who'd painted a charming watercolor. Caleb nodded absently, eyes still fixed on his iPad. But one thing caught his attention. She was happy. Not the polite, practiced kind of happy he was used to seeing. This was real. There was light in her eyes, warmth in her voice, the kind of feeling he thought had long vanished from her. A few days later, early in the morning, Caleb happened to walk into the living room and saw Jade sitting at the table, phone in hand, smiling, a genuine, effortless smile. She didn't notice him standing there. Her eyes stayed on the screen, glowing with something Caleb couldn't quite read. But one thing he did understand, he wasn't the reason she was smiling like that. From that day on, Caleb began to watch more closely. He didn't say anything, didn't confront her, didn't change his routine. Outwardly, he was still Caleb, composed, busy, successful. But something inside his mind had shifted. He remembered how, in the past, when Jade laughed, she would always glance toward him, as if to share that moment. Now she didn't. She laughed to herself. And that, more than anything, made him feel unmoored. A week later, he sent an email that no one but his personal assistant knew about. It included Jade's name, her recent schedule, and a few public photos from social media. He requested discreet observation, no traces, no contact. The justification? Personal security. That was how he convinced himself. 3 days later, the reply arrived, along with several photos. Jade was walking near an old district that had been renovated into an art space. In one photo, she was sitting on a stone bench beside a man, tall, wearing a long coat and a hat. His face was unclear. There was no obvious intimacy between them. But Jade's expression, once again, didn't lie. Caleb zoomed in on the photo again and again. This time, he didn't smile. He didn't ask, "Who's that?" He didn't pretend not to care. Something restless and heavy began to stir inside him. He started to remember all the moments he'd once brushed aside. The times Jade sat quietly through dinners, the times she pulled her hand away when he wasn't paying attention, the times she said, "I'm fine," but her voice grew smaller. He didn't know who the man in the photo was, but he knew one thing for sure. Jade was moving away from him. Not loudly, not through betrayal, not in declaration, just quietly slipping away, the same quiet way she had lived this entire marriage. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt something real, worry. Not for his reputation, not for appearances, but because he wasn't sure if he still had her at all. That Friday, Caleb attended an art exhibition fundraiser for a community education project. It was an event that drew both the tech elite and independent artists, a rare intersection of finance and feeling. Caleb was invited as a potential sponsor, and as always, he arrived on time, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, composed and elegant. No one had told him that Jade would be there too. The moment he stepped into the gallery's main hall, his gaze froze on a corner of the room where warm yellow light spilled across oil paintings. She was there. Jade, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple beige dress, nothing flashy, nothing calculated. But it was that very ease that made her seem entirely different from the woman who used to stand silently beside him at events. She wasn't still. She wasn't just observing, she was talking, laughing. Her eyes were bright, and standing across from her was a man. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The look between them was enough, familiar, warm, real. Caleb slowed his pace, his heartbeat tightening as if a hand had closed around his chest. The man didn't look like anyone from Caleb's world. Rolled up linen sleeves, calm posture, quiet confidence. He stood out precisely because he didn't try to. Jade hadn't seen Caleb. She was too absorbed in listening, in laughing. The way she tilted her head when intrigued, the way her hand rested over her heart when something moved her. He'd seen that once, long ago. He couldn't even remember the last time his wife had smiled like that. He moved toward them, not thinking. When he was only a few steps away, he placed a hand on her shoulder, light enough not to draw attention, but firm enough that she had to turn. She startled slightly. For a second, her eyes froze. Then Jade composed herself. calm, as if she'd known this moment would come eventually. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" Caleb asked, his smile so thin it was almost cold. Jade met his eyes directly. "He's someone important to me," she said, no hesitation, no apology, no need to explain further. Caleb glanced at the man, who only gave a small nod, calm and unbothered, as if he had nothing to prove. The air between them thickened. No one around seemed to notice anything unusual, just three people standing under warm gallery lights, as if the entire crowded world had shrunk to that single fragile moment. "I see," Caleb said quietly, nodding once before turning away. He left her answer hanging in the still air. He didn't stay to listen to the curator's speech or wait for the evening to end. He walked out, alone, without calling the driver, without shaking another hand. The wind outside was sharp, but his head burned hot. For the first time in a very long while, he couldn't control his own thoughts. When Jade came home hours later, Caleb didn't say a word. She hung her coat carefully, slipped off her shoes, washed her hands in the kitchen, then spoke first. "If you want to ask, just ask." Caleb looked up from his glass, his voice lower than usual. "Who is he?" Jade stood a few steps away, not flinching. "A part of my life you never cared to know," she said. The words weren't loud, but they cut deep. Jade didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't defend herself. But her calmness hit harder than any outburst. It was as if Caleb had suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of an earthquake, the ground beneath him already cracking long before he noticed. "How long?" Caleb asked, though he wasn't sure what he wanted more, the number of days or the reason she'd managed to drift so far from him without anyone pushing her away. Jade didn't answer right away. She walked closer, set her phone down on the table, and looked at him, not defiantly, not pleading for forgiveness. "It's not about how long," she said softly. "It's about when I realized I could be myself without needing your permission." Caleb went still. No arguments, no shouting, no breaking things. Just a quiet fury twisting deep inside his pride. He didn't feel betrayed, he felt erased, cut out of a part of her life where he was supposed to exist. And the cruelest part was knowing he couldn't blame her, because he was the one who had stepped out of their marriage long ago, long before she ever did. He just never admitted it. That night, they lay under the same roof, but the distance between them was so vast that even if someone stood in the middle, they couldn't bridge it. Caleb lay awake for hours, mind replaying the gallery scene over and over. Her laughter, the man's nod, and himself, standing apart, a stranger watching the woman who once belonged to him, now living in a world he'd never entered. By morning, when the first light slipped through the bedroom curtains, Jade was already awake. She sat in the quiet kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, eyes unfocused as she stared toward the balcony. The wind moved between the tall buildings, but inside her, something was quietly reaching back, to a memory Caleb had never touched, and perhaps never could. The first time she met Reed Coleman was at a small community art exhibit in the West End. It wasn't a glamorous event, no sponsors, no loud promotions, just paintings created by people who had lived through emotional trauma, most of them veterans or those who'd endured deep personal loss. Jade hadn't planned to stop by that day, but sudden rain caught her while she was out walking, and the gallery's lit sign felt like an invitation. She stepped inside and found herself standing still for a long time in front of a charcoal drawing, an image of a half-open door, and beyond it, nothing but black. No title, no description, just an unspoken weight suspended between the wooden frame and the dim golden light. She couldn't look away. That feeling, the quiet ache of disappearing from your own life, was one she knew all too well. "Did you work on the Downtown Revival mural project back in 2012? A man's voice sounded beside her, low and gentle, as if careful not to interrupt her thoughts. Jade turned. He had dark brown hair, stood tall, with eyes that were bright but never intrusive. There was something in his gaze, a quiet kind of attention, the kind that came from truly seeing and remembering. "How did you know?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "The way you use color," he said. "The way you leave space. I remember a wall behind the old library. I was in treatment back then and passed it every day. Always stopped to look." She went silent for a moment. That wall had been one of her favorite projects. But Caleb had never asked about it, never mentioned it, never knew she'd painted it using money she'd saved from teaching night art classes. And this man, a complete stranger, remembered it as if it had meant something real. His name was Reed Coleman. 41. He worked at an art therapy center for veterans with PTSD. He didn't talk much about himself, but the way he looked at each painting said enough. He understood pain in a language that didn't need words. And as they talked, Jade felt something inside her quietly unlock. Not through charm, not through pity, but through presence. They didn't exchange numbers, didn't make plans to meet again. It was just a brief conversation between two strangers. But when Jade stepped out of the gallery, she felt lighter. That night, for the first time in a long while, she opened her sketchbook and drew a door. A week later, she received an email from the exhibition organizers, an invitation to join a volunteer art group that met on weekends at the center where Reed worked. She wasn't sure how they'd gotten her address. Maybe he'd mentioned her name, maybe it was just an old mailing list from a past event. At first, she meant to decline. The reason was simple. Caleb wouldn't understand, and she dreaded having to explain why she wanted to do something that wasn't useful to their relationship. But that Saturday morning, she left the house with a small backpack, a few old paint tubes, and the excuse that she was meeting an old friend. The center was on the west side of the city, nothing fancy, nothing polished. Yet when she stepped inside, she saw paintings lining the hallways, rough and raw, but painfully honest. And there was Reed, holding a box of paints, sitting among a group of men with weathered faces, and a young woman relearning how to hold a brush after nerve damage. No one told Jade what to do. There was no plan, no structure, just freedom. And when she picked up the brush, she didn't think about Caleb or her marriage or anyone at all. There was only color, breath, and life. After that day, she came back again. Then without needing an invitation. Reed never asked why she came. Never asked why she seemed sad. They didn't talk about their personal lives. They talked about art, about the fragments of memory people tried to spill into color just to make it a little easier to breathe. She had never thought she would need anyone but herself to heal. But Reed, through quietness and observation, became the first person in years who made her feel she still had something to give. Not as a role, not as someone's wife or someone's reflection, but as herself. And that was something Caleb had never touched. Since the night at the gallery, Caleb could no longer pretend. He still went to the office every morning, still signed million-dollar contracts, still lived with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But in his mind, one name kept repeating, Reed Coleman, as if every time he blinked, he might see again that look between Jade and the man who had drawn light back into her. Without anyone suggesting it, Caleb reached out to one of the top private investigation firms he had once used to vet competitors during mergers. Only this time, the subject wasn't a rival CEO. It was a man in a linen shirt, with no public record worth noting, yet somehow capable of making his wife glow in a way Caleb never could. The report arrived a week later. Not long, not sensational, but enough to keep Caleb sitting in silence in his office for over an hour, without touching his phone, without replying to a single message. Reed Coleman, 41 years old, former Marine, discharged after nearly 2 years overseas due to a severe PTSD diagnosis, spent almost 3 years in recovery, psychological and physical rehabilitation. Afterward, instead of taking an administrative position in the military like many others, Reed earned his certification in art therapy, started as a volunteer, and eventually became a full-time therapist at a veterans support center. No wife, no criminal record, no political affiliations. Lived in a rented apartment in the Mission District, simple enough to draw no attention, yet steady enough to suggest a man who'd chosen a deliberate kind of quiet life. Caleb stopped reading at that line, irritation rising for reasons he couldn't name. He'd expected to find something, a weakness, a hidden motive, proof that Reed was another sentimental drifter clinging to fragile women. But the report showed none of that. If anything, it portrayed a man who avoided the spotlight entirely. Unsatisfied, Caleb made a decision. He would meet him in person. The meeting took place on a weekday afternoon. Caleb arrived at the therapy center under the guise of being a representative from an organization interested in funding community art programs. Reed stepped out of a small office, recognizing him immediately, but without surprise. "You're Jade's husband," Reed said evenly. "And you're the reason she's changed," Caleb replied, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. Reed nodded, not denying it. "I didn't change her," he said quietly. "I was just there when she started to remember who she was." "You think my wife needs therapy?" Caleb asked, his words sharp, edged like a hidden blade. Reed didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but she needed to be seen, and I saw her, For who she is, not for the role someone else assigned her. Silence hung for a few seconds. Caleb looked around the worn-down room, the crooked paintings on the walls, the scraps of paper with handwritten notes pinned everywhere. Everything was rough, unpolished, nothing expensive, nothing that spoke of prestige or power. "You live like this, by choice?" Caleb asked, unable to hide his skepticism. Reed smiled, for the first time since the conversation began. "I had the chance to run a big organization once, was even offered a director's position at a rehabilitation institute, but I turned it down. I didn't want to become the man I used to be." The words made Caleb pause. "I used to be in a relationship," Reed went on, his voice steady but heavier now. "I loved a woman I thought was perfect. She always knew how to make me feel small. Polite, proper, respectful, but controlling. I lost my voice in that relationship, and by the time I realized it, I didn't even know who I was anymore. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most necessary." Caleb didn't answer, but in his mind the pieces began to fall into place, slowly, painfully. Reed hadn't come to take Jade. He hadn't tried to outshine him, hadn't made any show of strength or competition. Somehow, though, he had done something far more disarming. He'd made Jade feel safe enough to find herself again. No permission, no conditions, just space to be. Caleb looked at Reed one last time before leaving. On the ride back, he didn't check his phone, didn't make a single call. He just sat in the back seat watching people pass along the sidewalks, each one living a life that had nothing to do with him. For the first time, he didn't feel angry or jealous. What lingered instead was a quiet, aching question. How did the woman who once lay beside me every night have to step into an entirely different world just to remember who she was? And worse, why wasn't I ever the one who opened that door for her? Since the day he met Reed at the therapy center, Caleb began to act like a man who'd just come face to face with his own limits. He no longer questioned Jade, no longer followed her, no longer tried to prove anything. Instead, he turned to what he'd always been good at: fixing things. For 2 weeks straight, he booked weekend getaways to Carmel, then Aspen. He emailed the stylist with suggestions for new dresses. He bought her a vintage necklace from a French brand she'd once admired years ago, back when they first got married. He even asked his assistant to cancel all his weekend meetings, something that had never happened before, so he could spend time with his wife. Jade accepted everything without refusing, but without gratitude either. She was quiet, polite, unmoved in a way that hurt far more than anger ever could. And it was that silence, not her words, that became the real alarm bell. One evening, after dinner at the city's tallest rooftop restaurant, a reservation Caleb had made himself, they returned to the apartment. No one turned on the lights, no music played. Just the two of them sitting on the balcony, each with a glass of wine, the wind brushing through their hair, the lights of passing cars below flowing like an endless river. Caleb spoke first. His voice was low, stripped of its usual authority. "Jade, I know I haven't done things right, but I'm trying. I really want to change." Jade turned the glass slowly in her hand. Her eyes didn't go to him. They stayed fixed on the western skyline, where the buildings were fading into the soft blur of fog. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice as light as the wind passing between them. "You've never asked me what I really want, Caleb. Not once." He went silent. She turned toward him then. For the first time that night, their eyes actually met. "You think I'm leaving because of someone else?" she asked, not waiting for him to respond. "I'm not. I'm leaving because I'm no longer me. I disappeared somewhere between these walls, inside the name Mrs. Caleb Warren, inside the events, the handshakes. Every day, I felt myself fading a little more, like a sketch being erased line by line." Caleb looked at her, and his greatest fear began to take shape. It wasn't losing Jade. It was realizing he'd never truly had her at all. He set his glass down on the wooden floor, leaning forward slightly. "Do you love him?" The question came out like a confession he hadn't meant to speak. Part of him didn't want to hear the answer. But another part, perhaps the most honest one, needed to, as if it were the only punishment that made sense. Jade didn't answer right away. She sat up straight, hands resting gently on her knees, her voice calm, almost heartbreakingly steady. "I don't know," she said, "but with him, I don't have to disappear to be loved." Her words weren't a knife. They were a slap, made of truth. No shouting, no tears, just the quiet, devastating kind that hits the pride of a man who spent his whole life believing he could hold the world together, the money, with power, with presence. Caleb lowered his head. No defense, no mask of strength. Just a man who'd once believed he couldn't be wrong, now staring at something he could never buy back. For the first time in years, Caleb cried. Not loudly, not brokenly, but the tears came, tracing down his face in silence. He turned away, not out of shame, but because he didn't want her to see the part of him he hadn't realized was still human. Jade didn't reach out. She didn't move closer. She simply sat there, quiet, steady, as if her role in that moment wasn't to comfort, but to bear witness. After a while, when the last sigh had dissolved into the night, Caleb finally spoke, his voice smaller, weaker. "It's too late, isn't it?" Jade didn't say yes, she didn't nod. But her eyes softened, not with blame, not even sadness, just the quiet truth of someone who once loved, now leaving because there was no space left to exist. And Caleb understood then. No promise, no gift, no grand gesture could pull her back from the place he'd driven her to. Jade left on a Monday morning. No drama, no tears, no note on the counter. Just another calm morning, except when Caleb woke, half of the closet was empty. She hadn't left a pre-printed divorce form, no email with asset requests. Everything was neatly packed, handled with the grace of someone who'd learned how to disappear without being a burden. There were no lawyers, no negotiations over shares. A week later, Jade simply had a friend deliver a signed set of papers to Caleb's office. The letter inside held no blame, no gratitude, just one line. "I'm not taking anything. I just need the rest of myself." She moved into a third-floor apartment in an old brick building, not far from the community art center where she'd painted her first murals as an intern. The place was small. No elevator, no concierge, no cleaning service. But it had a window that caught the morning sun, a rough brick wall where she hung sketches left unfinished for the past 10 years, and a silence that finally felt like her own. And there, in that quiet space, was a Jade learning to listen to herself all over again. Every morning, she brewed coffee with an old secondhand machine, opened the window, and played soft instrumental music. At noon, she stopped by the center to help with art classes for young people healing from trauma. In the afternoons, she returned home to jot down notes about the colors, the strokes, and the emotions each student had left on the page. She lived, not like someone recovering from a failed marriage, but like someone finally handed back her own life. One day in mid-October, Caleb happened to glance at a small article tucked on the last page of a city magazine, the kind he usually flipped past without a thought. But this time, the headline made him pause. Art as Healing, the first exhibition by the Community Therapy Art Group. Beneath the title was a photo. Jade, standing beside Reed, not holding hands. No intimacy, no performance, just two people facing the same direction. Behind them a wall filled with paintings created by those who once believed they'd lost the ability to feel. Caleb stared at the photograph for a long time, his hand frozen mid-turn. Jade's eyes in the picture weren't sad, nor evasive, nor searching for the camera. They held the calm of someone who had found something she no longer needed anyone's permission to keep. He leaned back in his chair and let out a quiet laugh. Not a bitter one, but the soft, hollow laugh of a man who once had everything and lost it, not because it was stolen, but because he never knew how to hold on to what truly mattered. He thought of all those parties where she stood beside him under flashing lights, the carefully posed photographs, the polished smiles chosen for the press. And compared to this small, unfiltered image, grainy, ordinary, but real, everything he had once guarded so fiercely suddenly felt weightless. In another corner of the city, Jade stood before a blank concrete wall on the side of an abandoned warehouse. In her hand was a palette freshly mixed with color, her hair tied back, her old shirt marked with dried paint. She raised her arm and made the first stroke, a gentle curve, then paused for a few seconds, listening to the sound of the brush against the wall, as if syncing herself back to her own heartbeat. The sunlight slanted across her cheek. She didn't know if anyone was thinking of her. She didn't need to, because for the first time in so long, she wasn't painting to be seen. She wasn't painting to be kept. She painted because she couldn't not paint. She smiled, not because everything was okay, but because, for the first time, everything was beginning again, from her own hands. No audience, no witness, but each stroke against the wall rang out like a quiet declaration. I'm back, not for revenge, for rebirth. Some breakups don't begin with anger or betrayal, but with silence. Two people who simply stop seeing each other in the same light. Caleb didn't lose Jade to another man. He lost her to his own indifference, bit by bit, until there was nothing left to hold. Jade didn't leave to be loved more. She left to learn how to love herself right. Sometimes, loving someone isn't about holding on. It's about having the courage to let go, when you realize you've become the reason they can't breathe. What do you think? In a relationship, what makes people slowly disappear without ever really leaving? Thank you for listening. I hope you always find your way back to yourself before it's too late.